how is it possible that, an elderly person in Bismarck, North Dakota is somehow responsible, for your reparations? And one of the crew members, replied, with a very pithy but, poignant and powerful response, which is like, but they're the same white people. And I was like, oh, okay. All right. How are they the same white people? Right. And that was a question that I put to them. And it was a question I had to go away and ask myself. And, what they expressed, right, was how the Caribbean was central, right, to the development of other, North American and British economics.
Good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are, at whatever time you're at. My name is Peter James Hudson. I'm an associate professor of African American Studies and History at the University of California, Los Angeles, and I'm speaking with Jovan Scott Lewis, the author of Scammersyard, The Crime of Black Repair in Jamaica. Jovan, perhaps you could introduce yourself, excuse me.
Sure, thank you, Peter. So I'm Jovan Scott Lewis. I am an assistant professor of geography and African American studies at the University of California, Berkeley. I have the pleasure of being here with you today, Peter. Thanks for taking the time. And yes, I am the author of Scammers Yard, the crime of black repair in Jamaica, and I'm really excited to talk about it today with you.
Wonderful. Well, it's good to be here with you, Jovan. And let me say first off, congrats on the publication of Scammers Yard. It's going to be a really important intervention in anthropology and in geography and Black and Caribbean studies. Also, I think in the history of capitalism, and I think the one thing that strikes me about the book beyond those kind of disciplinary and academic interventions is it's truly one of the most elegant ethnographies I think that I've ever read. It's a really beautiful piece of writing, and I wondered if you could just start by responding to two questions. First, or two statements. One is if you could give us a kind of very short summary of the book and its thesis, and then ask the big question: who are the scammers, and what
Mm.
is the scam?
Yeah, thank you. So Scammers Yard starts with a kind of central curiosity, which is with this issue that I did not coin, but that I took from kind of lived experience and articulation of that lived experience in Jamaica, which is this term called sufferation. And sufferation in Jamaica is a way of understanding the world of hardship. It is, to my mind, an ontological concern. It is an ontological recognition. It is understanding the world not just for what it can be, but for what it is. And out of that is produce a whole series of ethics and approaches and articulations, as I said earlier, about how to make sense of it and how to navigate it. And so being Jamaican, sufferation is a term. Like I said, it comes out of this experience. And I wanted to understand it. I wanted to understand what it meant, and I knew it meant something more than just suffering. And as you mentioned earlier, I do have these kinds of various disciplinary backgrounds and inspirations, and in something like anthropology, there's a great deal of concern with what it means, right, to suffer. We can think about a whole series of authors who work on that question. But something about this was, it felt a little deeper in Jamaica because it was just understood. And so I went to, think about what sufferation was, how sufferation was experienced, how sufferation was navigated. And in that process, I understood that there was a broader political economic story there. Sufferation wasn't just about the individual uh, experience of poverty, right? Sufferation was about the totalizing context, the totalizing condition of that impoverishment beyond the individual, but of course encompassing the individual. And so what that meant was looking at Jamaica's political economic history, thinking from the plantation, thinking, through the moment of independence, thinking through the moment of structural adjustment, the various moments that, the Caribbean, but Jamaica specifically has sought to emancipate itself from the kind of plantation moorings of its history into something something more. And it's a difficult process. It's an ongoing process. And so the scam to me starts with this question. Now, for the scammers, the departure for the scam is that a lot of the previous approaches to sufferation, right? I mentioned the moments of emancipation, I mentioned the moment of independence. These are collectivist approaches that drew on a very specific set of ethics that we can think of as cooperation, right? The notion of rights and so forth. However, these have all seemed to have failed, or at least they've, given very limited returns. And, so for the scam, there was a radical response to these circumstances, which didn't, fall back on what we might gloss more broadly as a kind of respectability ethic, right? Or respectability ethos. So the scammers, in many ways, fully took up the ethics, if we want to call them that, of the kind of post-structural adjustment neoliberal moment in Jamaica, where you have free trade zones, right, slowly overtaking the tourist economy as far as business process outsourcing call centers, emerging in Montego Bay post 2000 after liberalization of Jamaica's telecommunications industry. These call centers are promising, better wages, a better quality of life. However, companies like Amazon, companies like ACS, companies like Vistaprint that are operating in Montego Bay are paying somewhere around $1 an hour US. And so it's clear, right, that as Norman Gervan called it, the rules of the game, right, meaning the rules that keep, Jamaica and the Caribbean in a form of economic external dependence, were once again being perpetuated. So the scammers, however, took, the apparatus of the call center, and they found within it a kind of novel means of seeking a kind of economic opportunity. And so, it's important to get to that point from within the context of sufferation, because the scammers who I worked with, right, what they wanted was an economic independence. And so that itself is also a radical departure, right? In which the kind of political aspirations are no longer the primary factor, the primary inspiration, right, behind the kind of emancipatory thrust in Jamaica, but instead it is purely economic. And so what we do is we think about that, right? We think about what this means. So the scammers, using these business process outsourcing call center protocols, practices, and I'll say a little bit more about how they actually use them. They effectively earn a whole lot of money. Again, the economic thrust of their notions of independence bring them to a place where they begin to actually see their country, they see the Caribbean very differently, right? It now becomes a space of opportunity rather than a space that requires departure for opportunity in terms of the kind of historical migration or out-migration that we've seen from the Caribbean and Jamaica specifically. And so, in many ways, the kind of book moves from this notion of sufferation, grounding it historically, grounding it ethically, right? Carries it through to the contemporary moment after leaving the kind of post emancipation moment. And in thinking about the contemporary moment and thinking about the kinds of wealth that the scammers are able to earn, what the text eventually brings us to is how the capacity to earn effectively functions as a form of repair. And so, in a very pithy way, I like to say that the book goes from sufferation to reparation, by following the kind of political economic arc of Jamaica from post emancipation. So your second question about like how the scam works, Peter, you looking for work or something? Uh, listen, the times are hard. Um, in 2000, Jamaica liberalized its telecommunications industry largely for the purpose of attracting these, what we would call, like offshore call centers to the country. In other words, they needed to enable to build up the infrastructure. Jamaica, for the majority of its history has been, was controlled by a single telecommunications company, which was Cable and Wireless, which was the British kind of carryover from the colonial period. After liberalization, you had a series of players come onto the scene, the largest of which was Digicel, which we know is one of the largest, I think, telecommunications, mobile phone, cellular data providers in the Caribbean. But after this kind of infrastructural development, right, that is made possible by the deregulation of the telecommunications industry. It allows for a whole host of data centers, customer service centers to show up in Montego Bay specifically. They show up in Montego Bay because Montego Bay has long had the Montego Bay Free Trade Zone has long been established, for several decades as a site for other forms of free zone manufacture and so forth. The jobs that come effectively are not good enough, right? And what happens is that while these jobs are largely thought to be entry level positions, they end up ultimately being largely occupied by university graduates, right? So someone goes to the University of West Indies, Mona, in Kingston, they end up working in the call centers. So what that means is that for your large working class population who may not have a university degree, these are no longer sites, right? Or these very quickly become sites that are not available for them, to find this kind of opportunity. But the truth is that even within the call center, the opportunity simply isn't adequate. The idea about what happens is important to the call center in one way, which is that what happens in the call center is that there is this capacity to understand how North American commerce works. If you're thinking about the historical tourist trade in Montego Bay, there's a very specific and limited vantage point by which your local Jamaican is understanding, is perceiving, right, the North American white tourist. It is unidirectional. The Jamaicans are there solely to provide a service. There's a form of opacity, right, that I talk about, that does not allow for a full sense of how North American and white capital works. However, in the call center, all of the anxieties that we all kind of bring into a call center conversation, when that toy that you bought for your child hasn't arrived on time, right? Or when, you have, missed a payment accidentally, or, because of circumstances on your credit card, and you're calling that customer service agent. If you think about the relationships that are formed in those moments, right? The kind of vulnerability that you as a customer bring to that conversation, you can only imagine what that means within a context of a customer service agent on the other end. What kind of education they're receiving about the kind of everyday concerns, anxieties, and vulnerabilities of North American capital. So there's a sense of what people are kind of worried about. There is a sense about what people are aspiring for, right? That in a kind of conventional, tourist encounter wouldn't really be perceptible, right? But materially, what comes out of the call centers are lead lists, right? The names of these customers. And I won't go into too much detail about how the scam gets started, because there's a great deal of controversy actually about where the scam starts. But one thing we can say is that the scam, as a form of practice, does have a very foundational link to the practice of call center work. In fact, one of the scammers that I worked with, they had previously worked in a call center, and this is the reason why the form of the scam, that the crew that I worked with took the specific approach that it did, and the way that scam worked for the crew that I worked with. And in the book, I called them the crew, and I identify, with pseudonyms, of course, three main participants in the scam: Omar, Junior, and Dwayne. One of them worked in the call center, and as a result, the form of the scam was one in which they would call a potential victim and say, you have been, overcharged for your APR for the past, several years. You, should have been paying 7%. Have you been paying 7%? So, of course not, right? Okay, well, we owe you the difference. Wonderful. Well, the challenge is that in order to get the difference, we have to take fees. There might be some tax implications, and so we need you to pay that up front, right? And that's basically how it works. Through the process now, right? The scammers are using what I've noted earlier as the kind of affective sensibility about how these citizens of the United States, right, are thinking about credit, are thinking about their financial circumstances. And so, what it does is it really does disrupt the sense that somehow Americans are all, inevitably wealthy, right, or very well off. But in a contradictory manner, that doesn't matter, because actually the truth is that while many of us in the United States may be financially suffering, the argument can be had that no one in the United States, right, in terms of the middle class, right, who we might consider like white middle class individuals, are suffering as much as your poor, urban, and Black Jamaican. And so what happens is the victim will either send money to an agent, right, who is somewhere else in the United States. And so many scams have a network where, other parties who are involved might be located in New York or might be located in North Carolina or Florida. And so the victim sends money to that first point in the US, and then that individual who receives the money then sends the money down to Jamaica. That's just one of multiple ways that the money is received. But the way that it's received in the majority sense, or was received in the majority sense, was through money transfer services like Western Union and MoneyGram. Later on, you had the practice in which victims were advised to go to their nearby Walgreens or CVS, buy a green dot debit card. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's a debit card that you can load money on, and then to give that number, right, to the scammer in Jamaica, and that's how they would receive payment. Larger crews, who were bringing in significant enough cash, would effectively result to what we might consider conventional drug muling approaches, where they would have people just bring cash down to Jamaica, which of course is not necessarily illegal, if as long as you don't go over that $10,000 US limit. And so the scam works that way, right? There is nothing terribly sophisticated about the process of calling people. In fact, by the latter point of my research in Jamaica, while the crew that I worked with had used, emerging telecommunications devices, apps, and so forth to call their victims, it was, a kind of, recognized, well-known phenomenon that individuals were simply buying, international calling cards and just randomly calling US numbers trying to scam people. So in a way, there was something very, very unsophisticated about the premise, but the specific approach, or the specific scenario that the scammers I worked with used, was in fact very sophisticated in terms of trying to con people by giving them, by striking at the heart of most American anxiety, which is our credit score, right?
Yeah, and I think one thing that your comments brought up. I mean, it really reminded me that one of the things that's quite incredible about the book is a really detailed kind of narrative arc of the history of Jamaican political economy. And that's a really wonderful resource, I think, for readers. But I wanted to ask you. I mean, you brought up this question of the kind of imbalances of power between the Jamaican scammer and the kind of average white North American who may or may not be rich, but would be rich kind of in comparison to the subjects of your book. But this also comes up for you as an ethnographer, and I'm wondering, you talk a little bit in the book about your relationship to the crew, to Omar Jr. and Dwayne, and they bring you in as a Jamaican, but kind of keep you as at a distance because of class and color. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and how that affected the research of the book.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I'm smiling because of an incident that I'll share, unrelated to the scam itself, but just the way that class and color work in Jamaica. So a few things were at play that allowed me to kind of have access to these guys, right? And the question, when we were all meeting in person and doing stuff together as human beings, when I'd given previous talks about this work at various department visits, the question that always came up was like, well, how did you get access to these people? And these were largely anthropologists. There was a question about ethnographic methodologies here. And so, one part of the issue is that, or of the opportunity, right, that facilitated, my access, was being a Jamaican. I am from Montego Bay. I have family in Montego Bay. there was a sense of understanding and being recognized. Now, the other issue, and I think the biggest kind of opening, was that technically, during my field work, the scam wasn't what we would call, officially illegal, right? It was of course illicit. It was of course unsanctioned, but the Jamaican government did not have any laws on the books that technically would allow for, the kind of, you can be arrested, right, but not necessarily imprisoned, for the scam. And so for that reason, there was a great deal of openness about the practice. I kind of observed my first scammer while sitting, on my grand aunt Auntie Pinky's veranda there in Montego Bay, and a guy walks past the gate and he sounds very peculiar. His voice is strange, his accent is strange. And I said to Auntie Pinky, who's that man? How come he sounds so weird? She said, well, my dear, he's just one of them scammers. I said, okay. I was like, all right, Auntie Pinky, thanks for identifying something so fascinating for me. In this way, like, yeah, he's just one of the guys who's in the neighborhood and who scams. There was nothing, necessarily clandestine about the scam during, the initial period of my field work, which was, from 2011 through, 2012, up until January of 2013. And so they were identifiable. That created an opening that allowed for my being Jamaican, right, to, to enable a kind of conversation. What was interesting, and especially as it comes up in the book, the scammers were trying to explain to me sufferation, right? They were trying to explain to me poverty in a way that they thought that I couldn't understand because of my complexion. Because in Jamaica I am what they would call brown, what United States, in the black community would be called light skin. However, that racial encoding in the United States doesn't necessarily match up, directly with Jamaica, because there's a great deal of class expectations and assumptions built into complexion and into color. The crew were trying to explain to me sufferation on the basis that I couldn't possibly understand it because I was brown. What that meant was not that I was, prohibited from spending time with them, but in a way, it actually formalized the relationship in a way that, it, in this ethnographic maneuver where we learn, especially in anthropology departments, that, you should be learning from your interlocutors, right? There was something very specific that the crew wanted to teach me, which was about sufferation, or poverty's life. What it did was it gave me a certain kind of position within the relationship that I had with the members of the crew. Now, as far as not, being able to participate in certain things, I intentionally kept myself at a distance, because I knew that there were ethical questions, right, about how much I could become party to, and I did make a choice to not become party to anything.
You weren't drug dealer for a day or anything like that.
I wasn't drug dealer for you. You get it.
Okay.
I wasn't a drug dealer for a day. I wasn't a scammer for a day. I think that process of ethnography, this idea of needing to embody the subjects that we quote study, isn't it wasn't my objective, right? My objective was to, fully be able to receive, and, through myself being an intermediary, to, faithfully re-articulate and to state the experiences and the frameworks that these guys were kind of using to understand the world. But just to tell you that really quick joke, and I've been telling this in some of my classes where when we talk, in my Caribbean studies classes. When I was back home and I was back in my neighborhood, I would walk to a nearby grocery store, and, every day I saw this guy watching me. He was just sitting there at the corner of one intersection. And as I walked by, every few days, he would watch me. And one day I just said, how come you keep watching me? Like every day I see you watching me. And he said, well, I'm just confused. And I said, why are you confused? He said, I don't know, like, what you are. Are you from here? Or are you a tourist? And I'm like, why would you think I'm a tourist? And he's like, well, because you're brown. And I said, well, what does that mean? And he's like, well, because every day I see you walking, and brown people don't walk.
Mm.
I said, sorry? He said, brown people don't walk. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, brown people have a car, or at least you have fare for a taxi, but I don't see brown people walking. So here I see you as a brown man and you're walking every day, and I'm just confused who you are. You must be a tourist because you couldn't be from here. Right. And so that's just one example of how, race and class, right, as a kind of embodied, experience and practice is interestingly expressed and received, right, in the country. And so, in a way, what my brownness and because of my foreignness, effective foreignness brought, to the crew, was actually a degree of, I wouldn't call it, it was, I was exotic in a way to the crew, if I can be just, straightforward, right? Here was a guy who, is brown. I was at LSE doing my PhD, and this is part of my PhD research, who was there, right? Who had access to the same kinds of things that they had access to, right? And so in a way, my being with them was a mark of an accomplishment because, I had an iPhone 4, they had iPhone 4s, right? They would make fun of the fact that I wasn't actually up to date on all of the recent fashion trends, right? I mean, they were, God knows why, but all of Jamaican men especially were wearing like Hollister, right, at the time. Um, I don't know why. But I didn't have Hollister shirts, right? And I wasn't wearing True Religion jeans. Well, I couldn't afford True Religion jeans if I wanted to wear them, right? So, the point is that there was a kind of reputational element to the relationship, and I think that was another aspect of why I was able to kind of spend time with them in a way that I was. And so, that has everything to do with your very, astute question, which is about the way that race and class, color, as a kind of catch all for those two things, actually works in the country, and it worked in my ethnography.
Well, in Jamaica, and I think this is in some ways typical of many parts of the Caribbean, where I mean, I think of Jamaica with the national motto is "Out of many people, one."
Right,
But then Walter Rodney's always pointing out, well, Jamaica's 98% black, so who are these many
right,
people we're talking
right,
about? And there's a way that
right,
that motto it becomes a kind of way of, it's a power move, right, by the color elites. And sometimes
right.
I worry that. Searching for this kind of Jamaican multiculturalism is a way of denying access to the sufferers to political power. But I wanted to, the way in which you've linked sufferation to reparation. I'd like you to say a little bit more about that. And I mean, the first thing for me is the idea of sufferation is a really incredible one. And on one level, it seems to have a kind of Orlando Pattersonian Sisyphean idea of nihilism, right? And
Right.
a kind of hopelessness of the Jamaican poor. But as you described, there's also this profound philosophical element of it. I mean, the way one accesses the knowledge and meaning, not just the knowledge, but the meaning of sufferation through meditation, and then through hope. Like to understand your political economic situation, one has to think through it. I'm wondering if you can just say a little bit more about that and your kind of emerging knowledge of that as an individual, but also in its kind of longer historical context, and then the importance of reparation in this, because I think that adds a whole other important element to the book. It's not just cataloging the deprivations of the poor. It's about, okay, this is a critique of capitalism, a critique of racial capitalism, a critique of structural adjustment, a critique of neoliberalism, a critique of the unbalanced relations between the United States and Jamaica, between the West and the Caribbean. And Black people might not have found a way to destroy it, but they found a way to take from it as a form of reparation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that last point that you made about finding a way through it, and to kind of utilizing it, needs to actually be applied, across the history of the Black experience in the Americas. It's important to note, right, that the plantation, right, was an economic system, right? We think of it largely as political, we think of it as cultural, right? We think of it in this way that somehow simultaneously recognizes but elides the kind of role of economics in the process, right? And so when we read about, say, plantation plots, for example, um, which are, of course, the small areas, in the plantation that enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, right, were allowed to kind of use to cultivate their own food sources, right? Because of course the plantation, didn't necessarily provide the everyday materials for life and sustenance. So the idea that the plantation plot could be a thing that facilitates a whole host of processes. Being able to grow your own food means that you're able to create a kind of second-hand or secondary, or would really be a primary market, right? Within the kind of plantation landscape. People like Sidney Mintz, and Sylvia Winter, talked about how these plantation plots were instrumental to the formation of Caribbean economic systems, right? The notion of the Caribbean market. And so, in a way, I want to situate what the scammers are doing, right, within that kind of tradition, right? Finding a space within the kind of landscape of sufferation to actually to make life, right? As we say in Jamaica, and as the crew said, right? Make life means, to actually make life, like literally to make it, right? To find the instruments of self provision, right? The instruments of self fashioning, the instruments of self determination, right? This is what making life is. And, it doesn't necessarily have to occur after, some grand revolutionary, some grand emancipatory moment, right? It happens within the context of subjugation, right? It happens within the plantation, and it happens right within, as the scammers note, within the kind of context of a kind of global economic order that is meant to continue to extract value, right, and profits from the lives and bodies of Black people, right? So sufferation as a philosophy, then, right, is, and you're right about the Pattersonian, is that what you said, the Orlando Pattersonian nihilism. And I start with the book saying, listen, Children of Sisyphus was instrumental for me as a text, right? And I read that text as a teenager, right? I read that text as a way of understanding the Caribbean condition, right? And it's important for those listening who want to think about Afro-pessimism, go to that text, right? Go to that text and understand, right, where some of Patterson's early thinking. He wrote that novel, The Children of Sisyphus, as a early 20 something. Those ideas have had a very long life, and I won't go into that debate, but they've had a very long life, and they've had a very long life for me in terms of thinking about how we narrate, how we illustrate the kind of condition of what we might call entrenched intergenerational structural poverty, right? And it's not, and it's important to note that it's different than the normative, say economist or public policy specialist, framing of poverty, right? Which is just a failure of the economy, right? Or we need to do something to get the, what did Dave Chappelle call them, the poors, right? To get the poors, back on track, right? To come up with a new program to get them educated, right? All of these ideas in which, what poverty is understood as is as a fundamental deficiency, right, in one's quality, in subjective quality. And so I knew that that wasn't right. Black people around the world, and for my concern in the Caribbean and Jamaica more specifically, are brilliant, right? Like, no, they're not poor because of any kind of individual deficiency, right, or any cultural deficiency. Something systemic is going on. And so something like sufferation helps to explain that. Something like sufferation says, listen, if we go to Delroy Wilson's Better Must Come, there's a song, 1971 song that was used largely by Michael Manley's political campaign that year. But lyrics go, I've been trying so hard and still I can't make it, right? Everything that I do seems to go wrong. But who God bless, no man curse. I thank God that is not the worst. Better must come, right? That very brief lyric is a very, phenomenal and perfect representation of what sufferation is and how it is understood. This ability to constantly try and to not have progress. In the book, right, there's a quote from Juniors, and it says, like, look, how can, like, why? I'm a youth with intelligence. Like, how come things aren't working out for me? He recognizes that he has a capacity, right? He recognizes his innate ability, right? To be wealthy, to be, satisfied in these ways, and he can't be. And so the problem isn't with him, right? The problem is with the system, right? The problem, the problem is with the world, which, as the old Jamaican aphorism goes, the jackass says that the world isn't level. And so sufferation starts with a recognition, right? It starts with, listen, we understand that this is the way the world is. Now we have a choice, right? We can weep and wail and gnash our teeth, right? Rent our clothes, these kinds of things, or we can actually find a way through. And so sufferation, right, is not pessimistic, right? Sufferation is pragmatic. Sufferation is a recognition, that the system is, as the reggae artist Popcorn says, designed to set people up, but it is something that can be navigated. That's what sufferation is, right? As a kind of practice. And this is rooted in what the anthropologist Diane Austin called the kind of eudaimonic hope, right? That comes out of West Africa, right? West African religious traditions.
And so on one level, on one hand, we have sufferation, but then you kind of cut through it and oppose it with reparation. And talk a little bit about that.
I wanted to understand what this all meant. If a good opportunity looks like $1 an hour working at Amazon's call center, then what does it actually mean as a scammer, right? To bring in, 10,000 US in a month, 15,000 US in another month. And I'll say this, that, not every month there was there 10, at least for the crew that I spent time with, not every month was $10,000, $15,000, but they did come, right? They did happen. And so I wanted to understand, what did it mean, because I saw what it did. I saw that, for members of the crew, what happened was, okay, well, guess what? Now the son, or the youth, for one of them is now going to private school, now taking swimming and Spanish lessons, right? There is a kind of there is a kind of interesting kinship reaction, right, where the kind of partner, the child's mother, right, is somehow not quarreling with Junior as much, or with Dwayne as much. Things are happening, right? A car is being purchased, right? A second car is purchased, or a piece of land is being bought, just outside of Montego Bay. Oh, okay, and a house is being built. There was something so radical, Peter, right, to what this money did for these men, that I needed to understand two things. I needed to understand what that money meant to them, right? So I saw what it did. I wanted to know what it meant to them, but I also wanted to know what it meant to get it the way that they got it, right? I wanted to know what it meant for them to effectively be stealing this money, but for the money to have such meaningful consequence for their lives. A part of that was, asking, well, how do you feel about the scam? How do you feel about stealing from who are largely elderly, white North Americans, people who are in their 80s, and sometimes in their 90s? And out of that, there was a whole host of very fascinating and unexpected responses from the crew. The one was that the year that I was in Jamaica was 2012. A couple of things had been happening, right? CARICOM had begun its own kind of reparations commission. There was a great deal of discussion about reparations in the kind of political class in Jamaica, and again across the Caribbean. But perhaps most importantly, Vibes Cartel, the infamous dancehall reggae artist, had come up with a song that year, called Reparation. It was effectively a an articulation of how Jamaicans should understand what the scam does, and what it means. And it was like, as long as there's no violence, right? As long as they are, doing good things, there's nothing wrong with the scam. And the chorus, went on to say that, them call it scam, but we call it reparation, right? Every ghetto youth is a star, and so they just want to live like one, right? And I'm just like sitting with this. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And so, and I was aware of the song, and so I asked, the crew members, well, what does, like, why is scamming okay, right? Effectively, and I asked it in a much more precise way than that. And I have a whole piece in the book where I talk about asking moral versus ethical questions, and what they kind of allow for. Without going into that, effectively, I asked, please help me explain how are you able, right, from an ethical standpoint, to to do this crime? And the response was, didn't Vibes Cartel tell us? It's reparation. And I was like, okay, that's super convenient, and certainly a little, it's convenient, right? And I think one might be inclined to dismiss, right, because the song was out that year, because, right, it was again a convenient framework, for the scam, a convenient justification fundamentally. But I decided to take it seriously, and I made a decision for a few things. Well, for a few reasons, right? And one is, well, listen, when you're thinking about the Caribbean, right? When you're thinking about Caribbean studies, Caribbean history, Caribbean literature, right? Popular culture, right, is the epicenter, right? It's the modality by which Caribbean social theory is facilitated, right? You cannot separate that when you're thinking about the kind of experience of the Caribbean. And so, the fact that Cartel could make this declaration and the fact that it resonated, right, however conveniently, with the crew members, meant that it was legitimate. It was legitimate because throughout the process, throughout my time with the crew, they would constantly refer to other kinds of music, right? And largely, North American hip hop, right? Rick Ross was actually the crew's favorite artist, right? Because he embodied this, now classic trope of, a kind of hip hop arc where, a hustler, goes from hustling to, the end of the rainbow is like, some kind of multimedia mogul, right? We can think of Jay-Z, we can think of a whole host of characters who kind of fit that mold. And Rick Ross was one of the latest individuals, and he spoke to the crew, he spoke to their kind of ethos. And so Vibes Cartel fit in a very similar way, and he was asking for Jamaican society to understand the inputs into the scam, meaning poverty, right? But also how the scam facilitated, some of the broader aspirations, not only of the individuals who were scamming, but of society themselves, right? Like sending your sister to college and buying a house for your mother and all of these kinds of things. So then here I am saying, okay, well, let me take this reparations thing seriously. I had to say, well, okay, if this is reparations, how is it possible that the history of colonialism, the history of slavery in the Caribbean has effectively, but not entirely, been one orchestrated by the British colonial powers, right? We can't forget the kind of Spanish origins of Jamaican colonialism, right? How is it possible that, an elderly person in Bismarck, North Dakota is somehow responsible, for your reparations? And one of the crew members, replied with a very pithy but, poignant and powerful response, which is like, but they're the same white people. And I was like, oh, okay. All right. How are they the same white people? Right. And that was a question that I put to them. And it was a question I had to go away and ask myself. And, what they expressed, right, was how the Caribbean was central, right, to the development of other, North American and British economics. And I say that, in a way that sounds really dry, but, how they put it, was like we make them have what them have, right, was how it was put to me. And in that, right, was a whole sense of the kind of more recent history of, Jamaica and the political economy, right, where we could track the kind of sentiments of these young men to the post-structural adjustment period, meaning from 1977 onwards, where North America, right, begins to have a over deterministic influence on Jamaica's circumstances and Jamaica's political economic realities, many of which have directly and meaningfully impacted the lives of these young men. And so I decided to take that as a way of thinking about what are the possibilities for reparations, what are the possibilities for repair. If we take their political, if we can call them that, political articulations, their sensibilities, right, their frameworks, around this geopolitical, political, economic kind of history, and we marry that to the capacity to purchase, to materially remake their lives, then thinking about these two things together actually forms, right, a kind of question and, I believe, an answer for the matter of reparations, or at least repair. And so, understanding that as a form of reparations policy, and we tend to only think about reparations as policy, and not about the kind of like affective, subjective, personal consequence of what that policy is meant to do. I thought about repair as being, something that needed to be, prioritized over reparations, right? Meaning, I don't think that reparations is going to be a process by which we raid the banks, of U.S. private citizens, right, or white U.S. private citizens specifically. But what the scammers helped me understand, right, was that reparations, right, as its quality, which I'm calling repair, right, repair being the quality of reparations, has to take into consideration the kind of very messy, and tangled colonial histories, right, that are not neat linear kind of inheritances within the idea of the United States, within the idea of France, within the idea, right, of Great Britain. The process of colonialism, the process of slavery, right, was a global affair, right, that had lots of different parties playing a variety of roles, to different degrees, depending on where their literal investments were. Um, but there was a great deal of entangled kind of processes, that gave us, the kind of global trade in African slaves, and the centuries of, slavery and colonialism that followed. And these scammers recognized that.
It seems to me that they have a very, very acute and implicit sense of global white supremacy, effectively, and their location in the political economy of global white supremacy. I wanted to ask two more questions about the reparations piece, though. And the first is, and I think you've begun to answer this, but how would you say specifically you see Scammers Yard contributing to the kind of CARICOM discourse of reparations and the work of Sir Hilary Beckles and Professor Vereen Shepherd at the University of the West Indies, who have really tried to push this agenda? And I think one of the points that in the CARICOM platform is around kind of psychic repair, which you seem to touch on. And the second question is, it seems to me that there's a certain kind of divergence in the narrative of Black redemption that's been a part of kind of, if you want to use the phrase, the kind of emancipatory narratives of Jamaica, and a one that you know very, very well in terms of kind of the iconography and philosophy of Rastafarianism and the idea of repatriation, a return to Africa, because now it seems like we've Africa, and the kind of Pan African impulse of Rastafarianism doesn't seem to be at all present in the kind of discursive repair of the scammers. So I'm wondering if you could say something, if you have any thoughts on that, on the kind of position of Rasta at this moment in this discussion, and the very specific ways you see your book engaging with the CARICOM reparations movement.
I think what the book can offer to CRC, and but also, the kind of ongoing debates around reparations in the United States and elsewhere in the world, right, is that you have to start with the people, and what we have with a whole host of these platforms. It's controversial to say so, but they really are kind of like top down approaches to the questions of reparations, right? In other words, the issue that drives many of these global programs. I won't, sorry, not global programs. There's no global program for reparations in terms of actual political interest, or investment, but meaning, the various programs for reparations, platforms, policy, proposals that exist in various countries, is that they, in a very obvious way, are directed to help, edify the society through the subject's development. I think the CRCs, they have a 10-point platform. They have repatriation, for people who want it in their program, right? They have this question of psychic repair and having that kind of assistance and providing services for living through the kind of histories, of trauma. Importantly, there's a health component, right? Because it's important to note that the injury lives in the body of Black people, right? To the degree of insulin resistance, for example, and this is something that I've seen Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, talk about in person, right? About the way that the insulin medicine, the diabetes medicine that exists is less effective for Afro-Caribbean people because, as he argued, the kind of centuries of overconsumption of sugar in the plantations on the cane plantations, right? As an idea. I'm not sure exactly. But beyond these very interesting and novel, and I think really important, interventions, the general thrust of so many of these policy proposals are, effectively individual citizenship development that will ultimately go on to serve the nation. And so, earlier you talked about the out of many one people, kind of like Creole nationalist motto of Jamaica. So what we see is that the kind of reparations programs that are being advanced are, effectively meant to service that notion of society, that notion of the nation. Rather than mandating education, right? Rather than mandating, certain kinds of social services, what the scammers demonstrated to me, and I think this is actually controversial because I don't want to help reify a kind of respectability politics here. But if we think about what the scammers did with the money that they received, right? As I mentioned, they put their kids right in private school. They gave their kids Spanish lessons. They gave their kids swimming lessons, right? They built a house, right? They bought land, right? These are the kind of instruments of intergenerational wealth and opportunity that were facilitated without any formal reparations program, right? But were facilitated without any kind of government mandate. In other words, what the scammers, showed me was that, repair is being able to actually fulfill on your own terms, right? The kind of emancipatory, redemptive, if you want to call it that, kind of like ethos or thrust or aspiration, but one just requires the means to do so. And that's the issue that's at the heart of reparations is the scalability of these opportunities. And that's what makes it challenging. So but what I would love for folks to take away, folks who are thinking about reparations, is that there is a great deal of capacity and capability in individuals to understand what is best for them and their families and for their communities. If we are going to, demand that they be concerned with their communities, because that's a whole other question as well. And given the means to do so, they will actually care for themselves. And moreover, reparations, right? The facilitation, the provision of these kinds of things, and we could talk about the United States here. The provision of these kinds of things, right, don't need to necessarily come as a form of reparations, because we know that, especially in United States history, the provision of social housing, and I don't mean Section 8 housing, but I'm talking about the kind of subsidization of the development of the suburbs and these kinds of things, have all been facilitated by the government, and they never have been understood, right, in their provision to be a form of reparations. So, in other words, what I am worried about is that these programs, right, these platforms will attempt to give Black citizens, wherever they may be, what are effectively normative and to be expected services and provisions by the state. But calling them reparations in a way undermines, right, the actual debt that is owed to these people, which should be separate, right, from the ability to access adequate healthcare, from the ability to access, adequate and actually beneficial education, right, from the ability to access the market, to buy a home, to have job opportunities. The problem is that these everyday things are being framed by so many of these proposals as reparations, and they're not reparations, right? Reparations, is something separate from that. What was the other question, Peter? I forgot.
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you for that. That's, I think, a really, really smart and brilliant response. It's not simply that they're getting reparations; they're getting what they have always deserved, what we have always deserved. But I think the other question is how do you frame it in relationship to the kind of Rastafarian discourse of repatriation that emerges as a kind of out of the kind of global movement of Pan Africanism and I mean, from Rasta to Garvey to this kind of thing, and how does this diverge or converge with that kind of discourse?
Yeah, well, that's how I know, you and I can be friends forever, because you asked me a question about repatriation. And the scammer position is that those ethical impulses have passed. The idea of the notion of a kind of political liberation, right? A kind of, Pan-African liberation, as far as the scammers are concerned, right, is no longer right. So they've opted out. They've opted out of this kind of progressive narrative, right, of liberation. They've seen what it does, right? They've seen, what the past 50 plus years of Jamaican independence has wrought, right? They saw what happened between 1834 and 1962 in Jamaica. And so in many ways, they've opted out of that. Now, to kind of pull back from that and to think about how this fits more generally within a question of, of a kind of Pan-Africanist philosophy, Pan-Africanist politics. What the question of sufferation does is it demonstrates a kind of universal global black political economy, right? Sufferation is not specific to Jamaica. Sufferation is something that I'm actually looking at in a different way, but in the United States today, right? And we can see the connections between the kind of justifications for Jamaicans scamming North Americans to Nigerian oil pirates, right, who are attacking the kind of shell refineries and stealing oil and doing that kind of. They're recognizing the way that, as you called it earlier, and rightfully so, a kind of like white supremacist political and economic order works. Now, what that has to offer as far as a question for reparation, right, is that there is this need to kind of reconcile what we might consider the converse to the kind of white supremacist order, right? What we might need to do is reconcile the kind of global notion of blackness, because what the scammers actually point to, right, I think is a worrying trend, which is that people are opting out effectively, right, of a kind of global black politics. And you see that happening in a variety of ways, right? The rise in the United States of the ADOS movement, right? The American Descendants of Slaves for reparations. While there is an investment in a particular kind of politics, and I don't say that the scammers have, the same kind of politics, but what we see is there's an opting out of the kind of global, sensibility and the practical concern of blackness that's rooted, right, in a kind of global recognition. And so, to my mind, that's a great vulnerability, and that's a great worry. Now, to bring up repatriation, right, to bring up Garvey, right, is a way of centering, continental Africa, right, in this global order. And I think that does need to happen. It struck me, that we are heavily invested into the repair of our relationship with the kind of settler colonial spaces that black people have had to come occupy over the past centuries. Yet by comparison, very little work has been done to kind of repair the relationships, right, between Africans in the diaspora, right, and, as Garvey put it, Africans at home and Africans abroad. Something needs to happen in that regard. And so, as far as the book is concerned, the scammers in the book are a symptom, right, of a kind of failure of our global black politics, because left to the individual nationalist kind of concerns, they are effectively insufficient. And that's been, the kind of proof, right, that we've continued to live through, and we're continuing to live through, every day in North America, right, with the kind of wanton anti-black state violence that we've continued to be bombarded with. Now, as far as Rastafarians, right, Rastafarians have long had a view, and I'm glad I'm able to share this here. I grew up as a Rasta youth, and the things that I grew up understanding Rastafari to advocate for, I'm seeing the need to advocate for them still, but I'm seeing a will to kind of advocate for them now. When we're thinking about a kind of politics that is inherently anti-colonial, when we're thinking about the kind of felling of various monuments, when we're thinking about the discursive reordering of the world that we've seen, post BLM, these are all the things that Rastafari have been advocating for, since the 1930s. Albeit within a kind of theological framework, but still a politically oriented theological framework. Now, what Rastafari, is thinking about today in terms of repatriation, is a far cry from people like Prince Emmanuel Charles Edwards in the 1950s, right? From some of those early groups that like went to Shashamane in Ethiopia a little bit later. So the idea of repatriation now is a question that we haven't given enough attention to. My sense at the moment is that repatriation is about thinking about these relationships. It is about finding our global Black communities once again in kind of communion with groups and communities on the continent that are invested in those kinds of Black politics. And I'm not generalizing or trying to gloss over the the multiple complications. And in fact, we're seeing what's happening in Ethiopia, we're seeing what's happening in Nigeria. So it is still very complicated, but again, as I said earlier, it seems as if we've been giving a lot of attention to kind of working through those complications out here in the West, and we've been given very little time to thinking through those complications within the relations that Africans in the West have with those on the continent.
I think that's really brilliant. I mean, I think Angela Davis says something along the lines of freedom is a constant struggle, but I think those kind of making those Pan African connections is also a constant struggle. And I was thinking as you were talking about George Padmore, the Trinidadian Pan Africanist, in 1929, while he was still a member of the Communist Party, he wrote "Life and Struggles of Negro Toilers," which the importance of that book is precisely the kinds of connections that you're making, right? So he's looking in during the crisis of capitalism of the late 1920s and the 1930s at not only the modes of colonial governance that are affecting Black people in the Caribbean, in North America, in all parts of Africa, but he's looking at all of the kind of uprisings and forms of organization that are challenging that. But this is really one of the first books that makes those connections, and I think it's striking that we haven't seen kind of contemporary books as Black Lives Matter and anti-police brutality movements kind of expand across the Black world, as people are involved in the kind of scams that you're talking about, as you put it, both the scams and the claims for reparation in the United States, in Jamaica, and in other places. That I think it's in some ways it's our work to make those connections real and to narrativize those connections. And I think you've already begun to do that. I want to ask one two-part final question. And I think I love these two-part final questions. One of the things that most impresses me about what you've done in Scammers Yard is, and it's a certain kind of difficulty that is close to my heart, which is the difficulty of writing about the Caribbean as a very specific and nuanced place in the midst of the U.S. Academy, where it's the Caribbean is often subsumed to Latin America or to the diaspora writ large. If it's ever talked about it at all, it's difficult sometimes to even find the space to teach classes on the Caribbean, let alone on Jamaica as a specific place. And so I wanted to ask you about your genealogies of Caribbean studies and the importance of Caribbean studies for you, and specifically, um, I mean, two genealogies. One is through people like Norman Gervan, who you mentioned early on, and the role of the New World Group, and the kind of work of Caribbean political economy that they put forth. How do you see yourself in relationship to it? What are your critiques of it? How do you break from it? And I think the second person, and I guess this is the second part of the question, is in relationship to a tradition of Caribbeanist anthropology. And I'm thinking specifically about the work of Faye Harrison, who's done so much work on structural adjustment in Jamaica, specifically around gender and structural adjustment and women's labor. And I'm wondering if you could talk about then both the New World Group in whatever way you can, but also Faye Harrison's work, and how you've thought. And I think you've answered this kind of indirectly, but how you've thought about gender through the book.
Um, so yeah, to your kind of introductory comment before the two questions, you're right that there is, and I think it's part of the answer as well. So I'll start there, but it is about finding space, right, to kind of think about the Caribbean, in a way that doesn't fall back, right, on the kind of Cold War regionalism, right, that gave it some relevance, or gave it some of its, conventional academic relevance, and it's about thinking about, the Caribbean as a site specifically for the Black condition and understanding the Black condition, and that's been actually part of the biggest challenge, right, is the decentering of blackness, right, or the peculiar positioning of blackness where its epicenter is North America, and everything else is seen as a variation of that. And so, I've very adamantly, been a kind of supporter of Caribbeanist work within the academy, meaning like I teach Caribbean stuff, even if I'm not able to teach a Caribbean class, right? Caribbean thought is Black thought, right? If we're thinking about so many of the kind of Black writers who have been at the fore of Black studies, but who are in this very moment, right? Kind of critical to thinking about Black studies. You mentioned Walter Rodney earlier, right? We talk about Sylvia Wynter, Stuart Hall, C.L.R. James. You mentioned George Patmore. These are all people, Fanon, etc. These are all people that somehow, get taken up in Black studies without necessarily, their geographic kind of formations coming along with them. There's this interesting extraction of Black thought out of the Caribbean that leaves the Caribbean behind, and it's really frustrating, frankly. And so something like Scammer's Yard, I don't know, I think it's a lovely book. It's got very fantastic colors on it, but I am, I'm worried that, in Black studies, it looks like a book that's only meant for people who are interested in Jamaica or the Caribbean. Yet we, fail to recognize, again, the deep intimacies between the geographic forms of Blackness that exist. So I say that as a kind of like prefatory comment, to the specific tradition. As I said earlier, I'm a Rasta youth, right? I grew up as a Rasta youth, and we, and so I grew up with the intellectual tradition that preceded the academy in a way. And, and so for that, I really never had any kind of allegiance to any proper, intellectual tradition as we kind of see it coming out of the academy. Rastafari, we do a thing called reasoning, right? Which is again a kind of praxis of deep intellectual inquiry and debate. And so I wanted to say, formally, and on record, that that is my intellectual tradition. Rastafari is my intellectual tradition. Everything beyond that is about taking the framework of liberation, taking the framework and love of Blackness and Black people, that intellectual tradition of Rastafari gave me, and finding the necessary tools, right, to produce understanding, right, and to contribute to the kind of progress of Blackness. The idea in the Caribbean of somehow separating, and so we can go and think about the Caribbean tradition specifically. So the idea in the Caribbean of somehow separating political economy from culture, right? And you see this, especially North American Academy, isn't necessarily as easy. I mean, it's done, right? And there's a literary tradition, by which I mean, literary scholarship and novels and so forth, that have always been at the heart of Caribbean discourse, intellectual discourse. And so as a result, you have to also, I have to, I think at least, like, one has to pay attention to both the structural and the affective, right? The kind of political and the cultural, to kind of use terms to kind of help, clarify my distinctions. So, the New World Group were a set of individuals who, mostly, if not all, economists, who were thinking about the Caribbean in a way, right, in along a pathway that, to my mind, was parallel to the kind of cultural analyses that were happening. Right, I couldn't separate when you're thinking about something like sufferation, right, which is an economic condition. You can't separate that, the economic from the cultural, right? The political economic from the cultural. And so for me, it was necessary to kind of think through the work of the New World Group, people like Gravan, people like Lloyd Best, right? Because they were providing, a kind of economic and structural analysis of what brought about the kind of circumstances of Caribbean structural impoverishment, people like George Beckford, etc. But there was something inherently poetic. There was something inherently, qualitatively illuminating about the work that they were doing, right? When Lloyd Best, for example, takes us through, the series of like plantation hinterlands, what you see are the consequences and the conditions for a variety of lived experiences. These are not just purely economic processes or economic conditions that people are living within, or political formations of settler plantation economies, but they are the geographic bases for which people will begin to construct themselves and to understand themselves and living in response to that. So for me, there's a divergence, I suppose, in me using that work or their work in that way. What I do try and make sure that I do is always to to make the point that there, right, is an economic analysis at the foundation of this work. And so in that way, it's very similar, and I also take my cues from Sylvia Winter, right, who, right, to my mind, is one of our most, deft, economic thinkers, particular economic thinkers, and how do you not understand the economy by thinking about or thinking with Winter, or reading Winter? So for me, I think the departure, if there's a departure, if there's a kind of break with that tradition, it is in trying to think about the subjective qualities of lives lived within the kind of circumstances, that these theorists think about. And so thinking about Faye Harrison, what's wonderful is that, Faye is a Caribbeanist, and, is one of these Caribbeanists that we don't always think of as a Caribbeanist, right? In this way that people get subsumed into the kind of black studies structure, and we can again go back to this earlier point that I mentioned about like extraction, right? Extracting the kind of intellectual insights, right, about black life without necessarily bringing along the kind of geographic and political and economic circumstances with them. The questions of gender and structural adjustment, Faye, people like Beverly Mullings, right? People, like Carla Freeman and Deb Thomas. There's scores of academics who are thinking so importantly about, the question of race and gender, right, within similar circumstances that I'm interested in, right? That I take up in Scammer's Yard. The question of gender for Scammer's Yard is a question about masculinity, right? Sufferation for the crew, right, was, the fear of being assigned as being whatless, right? I talk about the question of whatlessness, right, in the book, and whatlessness is something that, another figure who I look to, as a kind of lodestar in how to do this work is Barry Chavanis, right, and who talked about the kind of intersections of masculinity, culture, and particularly economy. The issue of whatlessness is about, a fear of lacking value in your community, in within the kind of structures of your kinship within society. And so sufferation as a particularly masculinist practice is whatlessness. And it is a condition that Jamaican men seek to avoid at all cost. And it seems as if, for the group that I worked with, their cost was, participating in this international lottery scam. So for me, but it does really go back to your earlier invocation of Rastafari. What I understand is that, Rastafari understands, right, and tries to express that the global condition of blackness, right, is one in which violence that was both literal and epistemic and spiritual did everything that it could, right, to dehumanize African individuals to the point of making them, tools or apparatuses of colonial economic production. The thing that Rastafari, right, really shows is that ongoing violence as an epistemic form, right, is pervasive, it is mutable, it is ever evolving. And what we have to do is we have to have a kind of very clear sense of how the way that world works. And so when Rastafari says, listen, white Jesus and the Queen of England, right, are the same kind of evil, for example, that could be dismissed as some kind of, again, theological, preoccupation. But, it is about understanding white supremacy in, as Rastafari says, high and low places, right? It is not just about the structures of the state, right? It is about everyday discursive speech. It is about the way that we bring certain realities, into existence, and we, weaponize them through speech, weaponize them through, our everyday practices of consumption and our choices and the way that we regard one another, right? And so for me, again, trying to attend to that core objective, if I can call it that, right? Everything has been a kind of seeking for the tools, right? Seeking for the language, seeking for the kind of networks and kinship networks, specifically if we're thinking about the intellectual tradition as being a network of kinship, building on the work of others, contributing to the work of others. That's very intimate and important work, right? It has been in the service of this core objective, right? Yeah.
You know, I asked you about the traditions of Caribbean political economy, but as you've answered, we realize that the traditions of Caribbean political economy are really always uh, from the get-go turned on their head. And I think that the kind of point that you're making of having to move from a narrow sense of the political economic into the realm of the novel, into the realm of poetics, into the realm of kind of larger ethical and effective questions really shapes what that tradition, that intellectual genealogy looks like. And I always feel that it's often the poets, the novelists, the songsters, etc., who are better able to write about the economics of the region than the actually trained economists. But I think one thing that Scammers Yard also does for us, and I don't think I understood that until you spoke, and I think it's around the idea of reasoning as your intellectual tradition, as your the kind of your kind of disciplinary formation, if you want to use that kind of language. What I felt while reading the book, but didn't understand until you said that, is that that sense of reasoning, that mode of inquiry, that mode of kind of ethical inquiry pervades the book, and in many ways, the book reminds me of Walter Rodney's The Groundings with My Brothers, which also comes out with that very basic question, or that very that very core sentiment of on one level care, also of not just of listening, and of obviously of grounding, and where his interlocutors are more important than him as an author, and it creates a very special and specific tenor within the text, which I think is so important, but also so rare in academic texts. So it's for me, the Scammer's Yard is incredible, because it exceeds what we would expect from a regular academic text, and because we can feel that kind of love and that ethic running through it as a form of critical political economy. So Jovan Scott Lewis, University of California, Berkeley professor, author of Scammers Yard, The Crime of Black Repair in Jamaica, Rasta Youth. It's been good to ground with you this afternoon. It's a wonderful book, and I hope we can keep talking about it.
Yeah, Peter, thank you so much, man. I mean, it's a rare occasion to have someone, take such a sensitive read of the book as you've done, and an astute read, as one would expect Peter James Hudson to do. But I think, what you just said at the last bit is exactly right. It is a kind of work of love. It's a work, of black love specifically, right? And I appreciate your time, man. I appreciate love your time. How about that?
I appreciate it, man. I hope to talk soon.
Thanks, Lito.